Welcome to History of England, Episode 19, The Rise of the Lancastarian Dynasty. Now last time we talked about how, after the Peasant Rebellion of 1381, many in England feared that another rebellion would occur. So, the nobles tried to keep the people appeased and to accommodate the demand of the peasants. For instance, there was never again going to be a poll tax during the medieval age, and serfdom and the feudal order were to die out in the next few years. Now, last time I looked at the personal role of Richard II, how because he had been a king ruled by a minority council for years, when he truly became king on his own, he wanted to be sole ruler. And because of this, he made many mistakes and many enemies. And I looked at the two major parliaments that met during his reign, and how Richard eventually managed to get himself deposed, but then placed back on the throne, and yet still did not learn his lesson. And finally, I looked at the way he treated Henry Bolingbroke, and how that would bring on his downfall. So, once Richard II had made his orders plain about his cousin, which meant that, remember, his cousin was going to be exiled for life, and all the land that belonged to his cousin was now his, he made a huge mistake. In early May of 1399, he sailed for Ireland to invade that country. Now, why he did this at such a difficult time is not easy to understand for the historian, and the only explanation must be that he believed he was secure. After all, he considered himself protected by God, and therefore no earthly enemy could touch him, so what did he have to fear? A month later, Henry Bolingbroke sailed from France, landing at Ravenspur, Yorkshire, England, on July 4th. Now, Henry made it clear that he'd come to destroy the tyrant England, and he started his campaign in the north where he had most followers. England, at the time, was under the guidance of Edmund, Duke of York, the uncle of Richard and Henry. But York was not a principled man, nor was he a brave one. He did not have intelligence on where Henry was, and so he marched west instead of northeast, and in the confusion, Henry managed to make stronger his castles on his land and gather several thousand men to his side. At Doncaster, England, he met with the senior family of the north, the Percy family, and formed an alliance with Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and his son, known as Hotspur. Now, Henry claimed he'd come back to England only to claim his lands, and did not wish to be king. At least he said that to the Percys. Now, he may have been lying, but he may have also not been sure what the end game was going to be yet. He would proceed with caution. He'd take advantage of things as they happened. So army marched south, taking control over central and eastern England, leaving behind a few pockets of resistance. It is at this point Henry realized that Richard II was truly unpopular, and that maybe Henry could make this his advantage. Now Richard, meanwhile, was still in Ireland. He received news that Henry had invaded England on July 10th, but he did not go back to England for 2 more weeks. He could not get enough ships to do so. Because of this, his cause was lost. When the Welsh gentry were summoned to him, they replied that they heard that Richard had died. So meanwhile, Henry moved west to confront Richard if he decided to return. At the parish church in Gloucester, he met the Duke of York, who surrendered to him. York realized that Richard could no longer hope to stay king, and so it would be better to support the new man instead of the old one. So he joined Henry, and they went on to Bristol, where they executed 3 of the king's most prominent officials. Richard finally landed in Wales on July 24th. He stayed there for 5 days. And during that time, he heard that his uncle had abandoned him and that his 3 officials had been executed. At this point, Richard becomes depressed, but he's also defiant. He decided that his best bet was to reach one of the supporters that he had, one of the few supporters he had, the Earl of Salisbury, who was at Connery Castle in North Wales. So Richard disguised himself as a poor priest, and he took 15 men with him, and fled in the dead of night. Now, he would not arrive at Connery Castle until August 6th, and when he did, he was downcast and dejected. He often would burst into tears. Henry, meanwhile, followed on a parallel course. He went north from Bristol to Chester. Now, the 2 were ready for one last battle. Richard II and Earl Salisbury agreed to send representatives to Henry, demanding to know what Henry's intentions were. In return, Henry sent his negotiator, the Earl of Northumberland, to talk with the King and Conor. Remember, again, I'm using the title, but Earl of Northumberland is Henry Percy. Okay. So before Henry Percy arrived, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, hid his army. And then he met Richard, and he swore to Richard that Henry only wanted to have the return of his own lands and would protect the right of Richard to rule. Now, we cannot be sure, again, if Henry really meant this or if this was a deception to buy time. Richard thought about this for a few days and then agreed to leave Conway with Northumberland. He was surrendering, but he told his supporters that he would have Henry executed as soon as he gets his chance. And this must have been in Henry's head as well. So, Richard and Northumberland left the castle, and miles from the castle, Richard saw the army of Northumberland. And Richard fell into a panic and demanded that he would be allowed to go back to Conway Castle. At that point, the Earl of Northumberland swore on the host of God that Henry did not wish to depose Richard. So this was a bluff. It was a sacrilegious bluff. So the party traveled on to Flint Castle in northeastern Wales, where Henry had agreed to meet Richard. Richard was now effectively his prisoner. When he reached the castle, he spent the night, and the following morning from the battlements, he saw Henry and his army approaching. Per tradition, he said, "Now I can see the end of my days coming." Now he kept Henry waiting at the great door while he ate breakfast. Then he came down to speak with Henry, and only because Northumberland said, "You have to do this." When he arrived, Henry bowed to Richard and told him he'd come because he'd heard news that Richard was not governing well, and so he's going to help Richard rule better. At least that's what Shakespeare has Henry say, and more than likely this is true, since Henry would have made sure that the words were written down exactly as spoken for posterity. And he also spoke not in French, but in English, which showed that this is a new reign starting. Now Richard was said to respond again per Shakespeare, "If it please you, fair cousin, then pleases us as well." So later that day, Richard, Henry, and Henry's army rode on to Chester, and there Richard was locked into a small room in the castle, and guarded by the man of Gloucester and Arundel, who, it must be remembered, really had no good intentions toward Richard, since Richard had killed their fathers. Henry now set his mind to the future, and he called a parliament to meet at Westminster. He really had no authority to call a parliament. So, on August 20th, 1399, Richard, in chains, and Henry rode to Westminster, and there Richard was sent to the Tower of London, while Henry took up residence in the palace of the Bishop of London. At this point, Henry decided to claim the throne, at least it appears that way. He had been waiting for events, and now he saw his chance. The king was his to control, and no one had been able to free him. Now, there may have been a show of force by the archer bodyguards that Richard had depended on, but that event, if it happened, had come to naught. So Henry decided to read the histories of England to find precedents. In late August, he established a committee of dignitaries to figure out how Richard II could be deposed, and how Henry, the Duke of Lancaster, could replace him. The committee quickly met and decided that Richard could be deposed by the authority of the clergy and the people, the authority of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So on September 20th, 1399, a deputation was sent to the Tower of London to meet with Richard II. There, per the records of Parliament, they informed Richard that by leaving Conway, he had abdicated his throne on his own authority, and that he should make this official now. Now, Richard supposedly agreed to do this, but that's most unlikely. And per an account written at the time, the king raged at the nobles who had come to interview him and promised to have them flayed alive. Another chronicler, who visited him in mid-September, found the king angry that the people betrayed him, so it seems that Richard had not agreed to go quietly into the night. On September 30th, the Parliament met at Westminster, and it was packed with supporters of Henry. There, the official abdication of the throne by Richard was read out, and it was reported that, again, Richard had agreed to these terms, and that he had signed it. So, supposedly, he had signed this in the presence of witnesses, but most likely the signature and the document were forged. If it's true, it's only signed because Richard knew his life was forfeit. Most likely he had been threatened. The Parliament quickly accepted this abdication and agreed that Henry was rightful heir to the throne, and thus ended the Plantagenet dynasty and started the Lancastarian Dynasty. Now, Parliament did not have the right to depose a king. This is really a coup d'etat. Henry stood up and declared that by virtue of being able to trace his descent to Henry III, he was taking the crown in order to restore the realm which was being undone by bad laws and bad people. Now, he did have the right to take the throne, it must be said. He was in line to take the throne. But the complicated process of genealogy stated that the next person to take the throne, the next person who could take the throne, was the 8-year-old boy Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. He had the better claim than Henry. But England did not want or need another boy king at this point. So again, Henry takes the throne with the coup d'etat. He really had no legal right. He had to give it to Edmund to make it legal. But that didn't happen. So Henry was led toward the throne, where he stood for a moment and then knelt to pray. He rose, he made the sign of the cross on the front and back of the throne, and sat down upon the throne to cheers. He was then anointed and crowned. Now, Henry, from the early days of his youth, had been acquainted with the uses and abuses of power. He was only 3 months older than Richard. He had been the one carrying the sword in front of Richard when Richard was crowned in 1377. He had been in the Tower of Richard during the Peasant Revolt of 1381, but the two men had never really liked each other. Richard had in fact chosen to view Henry as a personal enemy. He refused to give him an official position in his government. He'd even gone as far as choosing his uncle Edmund of York as his heir, which was a rebuff of Henry. But the world had turned. Lancaster won the victory over York, but the forcible removal of the king would bring much blood to the realm. On October 1st, Richard was informed he was no longer king. He was then told that he was being sent in disguise to Leeds Castle, where he would be held in solitary confinement, and that no one would be allowed to see him. And the key word of his location for leading out, Richard was then moved in early December to the heavily fortified Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. Now, in the middle of October, some of Richard's courtiers and supporters rose in rebellion, but Henry easily defeated them. But now Henry knew that Richard alive would be too much trouble. So in early February of 1400, the king and his council met to discuss the future Richard. The records state that they said that if he was allowed to live, he would need to be heavily guarded. And if he was to die, well, his body needed to be shown to the people. So death had entered the room. And 2 weeks later, mid-February, Richard was indeed dead. Some say he was starved to death. Some say he was strangled to death. Some say that he refused to eat and so he committed suicide. It's unclear how his end had come, but his body was taken south, displayed at several points along the way so that people could see that he was truly dead. When the body arrived in London, it was taken to St. Paul's Cathedral, where a requiem mass was held. The coffin was then taken to the Dominican monastery at King's Langley, 21 miles outside of London, and buried there. Now later on, when Henry V, who was the son of Henry IV, was king, he would have Richard's body reburied in Westminster Abbey. Now one thing that can be said is that during the funeral, a new invention was used to dry the eyes of the mourners. For while Richard ruled, the handkerchief was introduced in England. Henry Bolingbroke was now Henry IV. He obtained the throne by violence, he obtained the throne by fraud, and because of this he can never sit securely on the throne, since what he had done could be done to him. So therefore he courted both the House of Lords and House of Commons, promising not to levy taxes, repealing many of Richard II's new, most oppressive laws. He also resumed the mantle of the warrior king. He pledged that he would lead armies to France and Scotland, and promised the bishops that he would be the hammer of heretics in England. But many still saw Henry as a usurper, And stories began to spread that Richard II had somehow escaped prison and he was living in Scotland. No, he was living in Wales. No, he was living in France. No, he's living in someplace else in Europe. This news was spread with the Dominicans and the friars, and the Franciscan friars, who preached in the open-air markets and taverns, and they preached sedition against Henry. Henry would have these men arrested, and he would have them brought in front of him. He'd hear them out, and then he'd see them executed by beheading. The fact that Henry felt it necessary and expedient to confront these friars personally suggests how seriously he thought these rumors were. He could never be safe as long as it was believed that Richard was alive and free somewhere else. Now, shortly after Richard had died, a group of loyalists of Richard had attempted a rebellion by riding in Windsor, but they were quickly defeated and they fled west, only to be surrounded and killed by the citizens of Cirencester and Bristol. The king's wrath was no more merciful. Any rebel he got his hands on was hanged, drawn, and quartered in public, an option that had been on the law books for some time, since the time of Edward I, but now it began to be used more often for these types of crimes. But yet even this severe punishment failed to deter other rebels. In the fall of 1401, another attempt was made to assassinate Henry by means of a poisoned spike being placed in his bed. And when this failed, someone smeared his saddle with a deadly poison, but both times the plot failed since Henry was on the outlook for anything that could hurt him. And Henry also had to deal with other kinds of protests. Despite his promises, Henry had been forced to break his word, and when Parliament met in 1401, Parliament was told the king's treasury was bare, and that the cost of defending and administrating the country was so high that Henry was in severe debt, so therefore taxes had to be raised. The House of Commons agreed to debate this matter, but before they did, they submitted various petitions and complaints, and only when these were heard and something was done about them did they agree to pass a new tax code. And this would be the pattern for all the parliaments that Henry IV would hold. He would always ask for money, and he'd always be told, you'll get the money, but only once you've satisfied the demands of the Commons. They were playing a tune, and he was dancing to it. But after all, the Parliament of 1399 had illegally assembled and deposed Richard II, and placed Henry on the throne, despite the fact that he was not in the Plantagenet line of succession, so why should they not attempt to curb his power? And in the summer of 1403, Henry's allies, the Percy family, rebelled against his rule. They joined a Welsh prince named Owen Glendower, who had formerly defied Henry. Now Lord Percy and his son Hotspur were supposed to defend the north against the border raids of the Scots. They had hoped that since they had supported Henry from the beginning, they would be rewarded, yet all they got was ordered to defend the long border, and were not offered any help by Henry. In the Parliament of 1401, they attended the Parliament, and they were told that records showed they had been given £60,000 by Henry, but they claimed that they only received £20,000. So where had the extra money gone? Either it did go to Percy and he was lying, or Henry basically cooked the books. So in the fall of 1402, Hotspur came to Westminster, and he publicly confronted Henry. He demanded more money. Now the chroniclers report that Henry punched Hotspur in the face and then drew a dagger on him. The alliance was now broken. The Percy family now publicly stated that Henry had broken his oath to them. He had promised them that when he met them in York, right after he landed in England, he would not only, or he said he was not going to seize the throne. He was here to take his land back. But they said that Henry then seized the throne from Richard, and he lied to them. Now, we'll never know the truth from this perspective. What did Henry really say? Did he say that he was going to seize the throne from the beginning? Did he say that he was going to only seize his land? We do not know. That doesn't really matter. In the summer of 1403, Hotspur gathered an army at Chester and proclaimed that Richard II was still alive. Now, this is the familiar rallying cry for all those who opposed Henry. Remember this. Owen Glendower was ready to move from Wales, and Percy was ready to move from the north. Henry quickly gathered his army, and he moved. He went to Shrewsbury, where the rebels were supposed to meet up. And when Hotspur arrived, he found the gates of the city shut against him. So while he sat outside the city, the army of the king advanced on him. They met at Berwick Field, 2 miles outside Shrewsbury, in what became known as the Battle of Shrewsbury. Now Hotspur had 1,000 archers with him, and he placed them on top of a ridge with the orders to observe the king and sound the alarm when the army was approaching. Meanwhile, Henry, knowing that he was the main target, had asked 2 of his most prominent supporters to wear his livery, so that it would be confusing on the battlefield who was the real Henry. Okay, so basically they're wearing his armor, and he's wearing his armor too. The army of the king advanced up the slope and were fired on by the archers. The sky was dark with the arrows, and the carnage began. As the king's men fell under this attack, they started to waver, and when Edmund, Earl of Stafford, fell, they started to flee. Henry now had to act quickly to prevent a rout and bloody defeat, so he gave orders for the main body to advance, and he led them into action. As the royal army began to push the army of Hotspur back, Hotspur decided to lead a charge against Henry IV to end the battle. Henry fell back in a faint, and Hotspur and his men were then surrounded and cut down. The battle ended when Hotspur fell. Now among the wounded was the son of Henry IV, Prince Hal, who had a wound to his skull. But he lived, and there was great celebration in the army of Henry that evening because they believed that Henry IV had truly been anointed by God. Truly been anointed by God. Well, 2 years later, yet another insurrection emerged in the north. The Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, rose up against the royal government and issued a list of grievances to the effect that Henry was demanding too many taxes and that the burden had become unsupportable. But that rebellion failed quickly, and within days, the forces of the Archbishop had either fled or been arrested. Now Henry Percy, still in power despite his son Hotspur's rebellion, found himself implicated, and he fled to Scotland. Scrope was captured and then beheaded as part of Henry's crude and brutal attempt to beat off all opposition to his rule. But the murder of an archbishop was an act of blasphemy, and Henry IV now was affected, for he had murdered a man anointed by God twice. On the afternoon of June 8th, 1405, the day after Scrope had been executed, the king was out riding his horse, and then he was suddenly stricken by some force so powerful that he later said he felt a physical blow. That night, he suffered a nightmare, and when he woke, he complained to his attendants that his skin was burning. His skin had broken out in some type of disease, which the rest of his life would come and go, and it would be called leprosy. Most likely it was syphilis, which he may have contracted when he was in the Holy Land as a young man. But Henry had passed through the fire, and after 1405 his throne was secure. He stayed cautious, he stayed stubborn, he was always watchful, yet the worst was over. But he realized that unlike the kings who had come before, he did not have the power or the resources to confront the great nobles. So he, kind of thought about it and, said, I'll think about this, I'll talk to you, and he compromised with them. He allowed his nobles to have a measure of independence and some influence. He allowed himself to have a council he reported to on the great decisions of his reign. He was a great manager of man. The crown was poor, the treasury all but empty, local law not being kept, the districts of England ruled by local faction, the possibility of riot and robbery always close. But the king did not fall. He muddled through, preserving his own authority and maintaining the Lancastarian Dynasty, with his son, Prince Hal, earmarked as the heir. Now Henry of Monmouth, Prince of Wales, as he was officially known, loved battle. He lived for war. Now, starting in 1400, when he was 14 years old, he served in the army of the king. He won various battles and skirmishes against the Welsh rebels. In 1406, he came back from Wales and he joined the council of his father, and he once became a leader of the council. He was 19 at the time. and soon gathered around him the young members of the nobility. He became known as the opposition to his father, the aging king, and his advisors. And he was inclined to more purposeful action, at home and abroad. Youth against age, hope and opposition against experience and fatigue, now the call of the day. Now Henry IV, still with all these illnesses, leprosy, whatever it was, had by now withdrawn from public view. He left the Palace of Westminster for the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace. And then he moved even further from London to Windsor. So beginning in early 1410, Henry of Monmouth was the administrator of England for his father. He set an expeditionary force to assist the Duchy of Burgundy against the French, and he tried to resolve the finances of the king. In September of 1411, he even went to see his father, and he asked his father to abdicate, so that he could be ruler in word as well as deed. But Henry IV struck back. He would not allow his royal identity to be put to risk after a decade of weary power. He made it clear that while he was still breathing, he would rule. He had some of his son's supporters arrested, and when the parliament was called later that year, he actually allowed a motion to be put in front of it that he should abdicate in favor of his son. The motion was debated and then rejected. Henry had won, for now. So Prince Hal started to think about rebellion, or at least that's what the rumors said. But those rumors were soon proved false. Then the rumors spread that Hal had seized money due to the English garrison in Calais. But in the summer of 1412, Hal showed up in London to deny this. And at the same time, he brought an army with him, or at least a group of nobles with him. We don't know. His army was a group of nobles. It was a big group. That's all I know. So Hal paraded through the city with his young lords attending him, and he wore a costume of blue satin. He walked into Westminster Hall, he ordered his supporters to stay there, and then he sought out the king. He found his father in a chamber, and he asked for a private interview. The king allowed this, dismissing all but 4 courtiers. Henry then asked his son to tell him what was on his mind, and Hal made an impassioned long speech per the chroniclers. Then he got on his knees and pulled a dagger and asked his father to kill him, if his father wished. The king broke into tears. The two men reconciled. Now, in the play Henry IV, Part 2, by Shakespeare, this scene was later rendered. But here it's Hal turning away from his friend Falstaff and toward his destiny as king. Now, 6 months later, Henry IV is dead, due to whatever was the matter with him, which could be leprosy, could be syphilis, but then again, it could have been just the physical signs of epilepsy or even a heart disease. He died in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey. In his will, which he'd written in 1410, he declared he was a sinful man, unworthy for what had been given to him by God. And unique among English kings, he got away with the crimes. He killed the man he succeeded. He killed Richard II. He killed an archbishop. He put down rebellions. He put down conspiracies. He faced assassination attempts. In an effort to force him to abdicate, he faced that off. But in the end, he confronted his enemies. He began the Lancastarian Dynasty, and he lived to die in peace at the young age of 46. His body was washed, his brain and bowels were removed, and then he was embalmed in a mixture of myrrh, aloe, and saffron. He was wrapped in strips of waxed linen, dressed in a long robe. His long brown beard was smoothed over his throat, the crown was placed on his head, his right hand was made to clutch the golden orb, his left the scepter. He was taken to the Cathedral of Canterbury. His tomb there can still be seen. So the king was dead. But as they say, the king is dead, long live the king. Prince Hal was now King Henry V. What kind of king would he be? Would he have trouble like his father? Would he win military glory on the battlefield? Would Scotland and France still be the mortal enemies of England, or would Henry somehow beat them back? Would Henry live to be an old man, or would he die young? All these questions and much more answered in the next installment of History of England. Stay tuned.